Wind lifted the cypress leaves. A barn hinge groaned. Lamp oil cut the cold. Two white robes hung from iron nails on the church doors in Yazoo County, Mississippi. A warning swaying in the midnight draft of March, 1871. The congregation would find them at first light, threads whispering like reeds beside the river. A third robe, spattered with creek mud and pine needles, lay folded on the steps, precisely arranged, precisely abandoned. Somebody was hunting night riders, and the county woke to the sound of fear pretending to be outrage. Because if the hunters of the night could be hunted, no one was safe, especially not those who relied on hoods to hide their names. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If stories like this matter to you, like the video and subscribe, because the record we're opening tonight was meant to stay shut. The sheriff walked the churchyard before dawn, boots drumming a steady cadence across thawing gravel. He told the deacons what he told the newspaper man. Union men did this. His deputies nodded in that practiced way men nod when the answer is provided with the badge. But the robe on the steps had a neatly cut thread at the collar, and the knot on the sash was unlearned. Not a soldier's square knot, not a farmer's quick hitch. Whoever placed it there had studied, then substituted. A signature disguised as housekeeping. A woman's hands could do that. A cook's hands, a seamstress's hands. 3 nights earlier, a lantern had jittered along the levee road past the gin house. Sound, river gnawing the bank. Smell, damp rope and mash feed. Texture, burlap rough against knuckles. Riders in white moved through cane like ghosts trying to remember their bodies. They were not headed to a meeting. They were not headed to prayer. When they dismounted near a live oak, the moon watched, then looked away. Afterward, the town said very little. People crossed streets rather than cross stairs. Shopkeepers shut early. A barber refused to sweep the back room where a chair sat askew and a mirror had cracked. Hard facts thinned into rumors. A name disappeared from the ledger at the cotton press. The Saturday edition in Jackson used the word incident. No one used the word lynching in public, not even once. A kitchen on Cedar Street worked later than usual that week. Sound, kettle hiss, and the click of a cooling stove. Smell, starch, lye, and molasses, muslin damp beneath a flat iron. A freed woman, called Clara in one set of records and Clarissa in another, pressed a seam until the cloth lay obedient as paper. She had come across the big black river after emancipation with a trunk, a Bible leaf, and the careful habit of not speaking first. She was the kind of person who heard the whole conversation before offering a single word. And when she did, it was to ask a question that made everyone else picture what they hadn't wanted to see. She did not say her sister's name aloud. She kept it hidden the way some soldiers kept spare cartridges, close, warmed by the body, meant for a specific hour. A week before the robes appeared, the Freedmen's School at Pine Hill dismissed early when hoofbeats rattled the road like loose nails in a coffee can. Children went home in pairs. A teacher wrote a line in the margin of her primer. Field note, February 29, 1871. Sundown riders west of the mill. No patrol from sheriff. Warned the girls to stay together. In a county ledger stamped with the year 1870, the sheriff's office logged rope purchases for repairs, fences, and lye for sanitation, pest control. The entries were neat, the sums exact. On the back flyleaf, unofficial, unnumbered, someone had pressed a dried wildflower that grows near creek crossings where horses hesitate. Whose hands made that scrapbook of silence? In the documentary record, Clara steps into view in a list of wages. $1.50 per week. Sewing, washing, mending. Then she disappears into gaps. Gaps where night work lived. She traded thimbles for feed sacks, sashes for towline, recipes for schedules. People who had never noticed her now found their back doors bolted and their dogs uneasy. The first robe vanished from its peg behind a smokehouse. 2 nights later, it returned nailed to the smokehouse door, hem rinsed and weighted with creek grit. No blood, no initials. Just a small decorative stitch at the neckline, a maiden's stitch, mocking a man's habit of hiding behind a sheet. Silence moves like weather. At dawn on the day the church doors bore their new adornment, a whistle blew at the sawmill. A bright, ordinary sound. Men filed in with lunch pails. On the boardwalk, the editor of the Yazoo Democrat rolled a fresh headline and came up short on adjectives. Across the square, a black Union veteran tipped his cap and declined to look at the church. A grocer's boy paused, then kept sweeping sunflower seeds into the gutter. Bystanders absorbed, enabled, ignored. Commerce pretended to be neutral. What would you do if the thing you feared was finally afraid? A pattern emerged, but only if you knew what to look for. Meetings in a pasture north of town like clockwork on Thursday nights. A ferry schedule altered by low water. A gambler from Vicksburg passing through with a spool of fine wire. Then the note. 3 words scratched on the mill's chalkboard after hours. Corn by lantern. It meant, ride tonight. It meant, Clara would be waiting where the levee dike narrowed and the palmetto hit a cut bank. The hunters carried torches. They joked the way men do when they want to be braver than they feel. One named his horse after a Confederate general. One kept touching his left sleeve, where he wore a signet ring under the robe. One, broad-shouldered, impatient, used a sheriff's voice even when he spoke softly. They passed, the old field where federal tents had rotted into the dirt after the surrender. The road bent. The river sounded louder, and then the torches guttered all at once, each flame bowing to a sudden practiced gust. Who builds a wind? Someone had strung a length of line, river-worn, tarred, nearly invisible, between 2 black gum trees. The first horse halted hard. The second reared. The third found its way forward and stopped with both front hooves set delicate as a dancer's at the levee lip. A voice did not speak. A shot did not crack. Instead, the cool metallic clink of a cowbell tied to nothing, rung by no human hand, swinging on the far side of the ditch. The riders froze at a sound farm men knew since boyhood, a call and answer that said, plainly, I see you. They cut their robes on cane stubble getting clear. One fell. He rose with palms muddy and a mouth full of river weeds. He spat, cursed, laughed, called his companions nervous. Then he saw his reflection in the water. White cloth blotched like a moth's wing, hood a drowned sack, eyes holes suddenly too honest. He looked away first. In the morning, the man who fell did not fetch his robe. It hung from the church nail instead, the sash tied in the same unfamiliar knot as the others. The sheriff stood close enough to see the stitch at the collar and did not mention it. He said the word vigilantes. He said agitators. He said outsiders. Then he sent a deputy to the ferry crossing and another to the gin house and took the creek road alone. The creek road kept its secrets in cattails and cutbanks. Sound. A kingfisher's rattle and the far-off pound of a pile driver fixing flood damage. Smell, river mud, axle grease, and the faint sweetness of crushed sassafras. Texture, knotted hemp kept dry in a saddlebag. He reached the live oak before noon. A short length of fresh rope hung from a lower branch. the loop tied tidy and wrong. Wrong if you'd been trained to tie it right. Wrong if you prided yourself on perfect work. Someone had studied the sheriff's knot and left a bad imitation. It was bait, and he knew it, and he smiled anyway. What happens when the most powerful man in the county decides the trap belongs to him? At the edge of the scene, a boy from the mill watched, straw hat in his hands, and said nothing. He saw the sheriff test the rope, saw him kick at disturbed leaves, saw him pocket a tiny stitch cutter dropped in last night's dark. He told no one. That afternoon, he sold that stitch cutter to the riverboat clerk for 50 cents and a tin of cough lozenges. The boat left at dusk, carrying a tool that could nick through canvas and through a hood's hem, clean and fast. He was not the only one who stayed quiet. Night listens and learns. Downstream, hidden by willow shade, a woman with starch on her skirt folded a length of sash into her apron and checked the time by the whistle of the upbound boat, 10:28 a.m. when it passed the bend each day. She had measured the county by its noises and made a map from them. She did not speak her sister's name. She moved before the whistle's echo had settled, toward a mill race where men would gather after dark. Who will step into the lane first? The rider, the sheriff, or the seamstress with the steady hands? A ledger entry dated March 3, 1871, sits in a courthouse box today, the ink browned to the color of syrup. Sheriff's memorandum, private. 3 robes recovered. Public calm. Arrange special patrol tonight on Creek Road. Bring new rope. Bring new rope. The church bell tolled the hour. The sheriff lifted his chin and followed the sound into evening. He would not return by the same road. The first body was found in a cotton trench at dawn, pale cloth half buried in red mud. A crow sat nearby, unbothered, preening its wings as if guarding the evidence. The sheriff called it an accident. The doctor called it misadventure. But everyone else, the people who worked the land, knew better, because the Klan had taken one of their own, and the earth itself seemed to reject him. The morning smelled of wet soil, axle grease, and gunpowder too fresh to be old. Beneath the man's robe, his boots were missing. His belt buckle had been turned backward, and a single magnolia leaf had been pinned to his chest, a symbol no one recognized. Not yet. Witnesses described hoofprints that led nowhere. The preacher said it was divine justice. The blacksmith said it was a warning. The sheriff said it was Yankee superstition. But by sundown, another robe had gone missing from a back porch near the sawmill. And that was how the pattern began. Clara had spent 11 years in kitchens where her name was used less than her apron. Her sister Ada had been lynched 6 months earlier, dragged from their rented cabin under accusation of stealing a locket she had, in fact, mended for a white woman. Her body had been left near the same levee where Union soldiers once built a pontoon bridge. The Klan never hid their work. They celebrated it. In the coroner's notes, Ada's death was unsolved. In Clara's heart, it was numbered, first of many. After the war, freedwomen often kept ledgers of debts owed and wages stolen. Clara's ledger was written differently. Each line bore a name, a date, and a single mark. A length of cord in inches. She had measured rope the way a seamstress measures cloth, each knot corresponding to a man she believed responsible. Personal record, March 10th, 1871. 6 names remain. The cloth will be finished by summer. Sound, flies. Smell, gun oil, starch, and kerosene. Texture, paper soft from handling. Her trade gave her access. She laundered for the judge's wife, mended sleeves for the sheriff's deputy, and pressed robes whose wearers never wondered who stitched their hoods. Her hands had been invisible so long that when the killing started, no one looked for her. They looked for soldiers, for outlaws, for ghosts. But ghosts don't leave evidence nailed in daylight. The sheriff convened a meeting in Yazoo's small courthouse, its clapboard siding peeling under the southern sun. Sound, the drone of flies. Smell, pipe smoke and varnish. Texture, heat thick enough to slow thought. 3 dead, he told the gathered men, and someone means to make it look like Providence. He pointed to a crude map. Chalk lines, red pins marking bodies found near the river. She or he comes from the west side, knows the levee roads, knows your meeting places. A young planter whispered, "A colored man, you think?" The sheriff paused, then spoke slow. "Ain't no man who can move unseen this long." The men murmured, uneasy laughter masking a truth they refused to say aloud. They were being stalked. By nightfall, every lantern in Yazoo burned low, every dog barked at shadows, and every rider carried a revolver instead of a whip. But Clara moved like water. April's first storm rolled across the delta with thunder that sounded like cannon fire from wars not long buried. In the darkness, lightning showed the cotton gin silhouetted against the fields, a skeletal frame of gears and belts. Inside, 2 men had gathered to trade names and orders for the next punishment ride. One was the sheriff's cousin, the other the postmaster. They didn't notice the slight shift in the rafters or the smell of lamp oil until the match fell. The fire began quietly, like breath under the floorboards. It spread upward, wrapping beams in blue light. The men's screams reached the road, but the storm swallowed them whole. At dawn, the townspeople found the gin smoldering, the gears fused in place. Hanging from a bent support beam was another white robe, this one half burned, its sash tied in the same peculiar knot as the ones at the church. Pinned to it, a magnolia leaf again, still green. Justice by hand. By mid-April, Yazoo County split down invisible lines. The black community whispered prayers for deliverance while secretly passing food and notes to a figure they never named. Poor whites claimed Union veterans were exacting revenge. The press called it the Phantom Rider, but those who worked the fields knew different. They'd seen Clara walking alone near the marsh with a coil of rope and a tin pail of starch. The sheriff increased patrols, promising swift punishment. Yet each patrol ended with more fear and less trust. Horses went missing. Powder stores were found wet. Someone was sabotaging the infrastructure of hate itself, and the sheriff began to suspect that whoever this hunter was, they knew him personally. Bystanders saw the aftermath. They always do. A white family found their fence marked with 3 tiny stitches of red thread. They painted over it by morning. A merchant noticed a hood stuffed into his trash bin, damp and cut down the middle. He said nothing. What would you do if silence meant safety and truth meant joining the dead? Each week, another robe appeared nailed somewhere public. Barns, church doors, courthouse steps, always paired with that same leaf. It became a kind of calendar, counting down to something larger. A school teacher passing through Yazoo kept a diary now preserved in a state archive. May 2nd, 1871. The sheriff's face grows thinner each day. He speaks of law, but the law has lost its shadow. At night I hear singing from the colored quarters, low and steady. Not mourning, something older. The something older was a rhythm brought across the ocean generations ago. A rhythm of counting, weaving, measuring. Clara's sewing table became her altar. The rope she used for drying laundry was the same length she'd measured in her ledger for the next name. She knew the Klan would meet again soon, and she knew who led them. By June, the sheriff could no longer hide his fear behind sermons or arrests. He staged a trap near the very oak where Ada had been found. He left a robe hanging there, a decoy with a single gold button, his own insignia. Then he waited with 2 deputies and a preacher willing to bless the ambush. But the preacher never made it home, and when the sheriff woke at dawn, he found the rope gone, the gold button missing, and a message carved into the tree's bark. "Your turn." A breeze rattled the magnolia leaves above him like applause. He turned toward town, face pale, mind racing. Somewhere behind him, a figure watched. Steady hands, patient breath, eyes fixed on the man who once commanded mobs. Because some justice walks on 2 feet, silent as prayer. By the following week, only one name remained in Clara's ledger, circled twice in pencil: Sheriff Eli Granger. And the noose she'd been saving hung hidden beneath her floorboards, coiled like a question waiting for its answer. The hunted becomes the hunter. Thunder rolled low across Yazoo County, as if the sky itself wanted to caution what came next. The last rope Clara measured lay on her kitchen table, 3 feet longer than the rest. She wound it carefully, running her thumb along the fibers the way other women might trace rosary beads. The sound of the hemp sliding against her skin was soft, nearly kind, because this wasn't about rage anymore. It was precision. Sheriff Eli Granger had led the posse that lynched Ada 6 months earlier. The rope from that night still hung in the courthouse loft, coiled beside spare sashes. No one had dared touch it, as if it might remember what it had done. Clara intended to make it remember. By late June, Yazoo's summer heat pressed like a weight on the chest. The courthouse clock ticked slower in the thick air. Shopkeepers hung closed for inventory signs to avoid conversation. Each day began with rumor and ended with denial. People wanted to believe the killings were over, that the burned gin, the nailed robes, the magnolia leaves were warnings fulfilled. But, deep down, everyone knew there was one man still untouched. One man who claimed to hold the law while standing behind its mask. Granger's deputies began guarding his house at night. One, a young man named Caleb Fenn, swore he saw a woman's silhouette near the stables on June 27th, just before midnight. When he gave chase, the figure disappeared into the corn rows, leaving behind only a small scrap of calico cloth tied in a knot that wasn't quite right. Clara's signature mistake. "Maybe just a washerwoman," Granger muttered. "Maybe the ghost they all talk about." The deputies exchanged looks but said nothing. Even armed men fear what they cannot name. Sound, the hum of cicadas swelling like a tide. Smell, creosote from the railroad ties stacked behind the depot. Texture, rough twine biting into skin. These were the things that filled Clara's world as she prepared. She had watched Granger's habits for weeks. The hour he left the courthouse, the route he took home, the time he visited the church to pray in private. She knew which key he kept on a separate chain, the one that opened the evidence room upstairs. Inside that room lay Ada's death warrant in disguise, the rope, tagged and stored for investigation. On the evening of July 1st, the sheriff poured himself whiskey and pretended not to count footsteps outside. His windows were latched, curtains drawn. The town was quiet except for frogs and the faint metallic scrape of something being dragged across the courthouse yard. When the lamp flickered, he told himself it was wind. When the door hinges sighed, he told himself it was memory. At 11:43 p.m., the courthouse bell rang once, an impossible sound, since the rope for the bell had been cut weeks earlier by pranksters. Granger rose from his chair and reached for his gun. The second toll came slower, deliberate. He stepped into the hall. A figure stood near the staircase landing, half lit by the lamplight seeping through the glass transom. She wore no robe, no disguise, just a plain dress and a scarf tied back from her face. In her hand, the rope from the evidence shelf. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman didn't answer. She only held up the rope, showing the faint stain where Ada's throat once pressed. Granger's voice faltered. "You don't know what you're doing." But she did. The courthouse janitor, a black man named Reuben Tate, would later tell a federal investigator that he heard the sheriff's voice echoing through the stairwell that night. First angry, then pleading, then nothing but the creak of wood under weight. Statement, July 2nd, 1871. "I waited till morning light. Found him hanging where the bell rope used to run, hands bound, feet bare. Rope marked from old use like it had done work before. Pinned to Granger's coat was the final magnolia leaf, fresh, fragrant, untouched by rain. The town erupted before sunrise. Riders swept through, black neighborhoods, firing pistols into the air, demanding names that no one gave. The church bell rang again, this time pulled by deputies to call an emergency meeting. They called for martial law. They blamed outside agitators. Yet when the deputies searched the sheriff's home, they found his personal diary opened to a half-written page. June 30th, 1871. "I dreamed of her again. The woman at the river. Ada. She was singing, not sorrowful, almost thankful. Said her sister still waits below the magnolia tree. I woke before dawn. Can't recall the hymn." The handwriting ended mid-line. By the next day, word spread as far as Jackson. Klux chief found dead, no suspects named. The story made northern papers within the week. To white readers, it was just another southern mystery. To freedmen, it was a song of warning and deliverance. Neighbors had seen shadows that night. A washerwoman walking toward the courthouse with a pail. A lamp moving across the second floor when no one should have been inside. Yet when questioned, each claimed ignorance. "I saw nothing. She never harmed a soul." Sometimes justice comes by its own hand. Even Reuben Tate, the janitor who had found the body, refused to swear under oath that he recognized the woman. What would you do? Tell the truth and risk losing the only justice your people ever saw? Or lie and let the rope speak for you? Clara left Yazoo the next morning aboard a flatboat carrying timber north. Witnesses said she wore a man's coat, head down, hands bandaged as if from burns. Others swore she never boarded the boat at all, that she slipped into the river mist and was gone before the sun climbed over the levee. Only one clue remained in her rented cabin, a folded scrap of Ada's dress, stitched with 7 letters and a date. Finished July 2nd. 7 men for 7 letters, 7 robes, 7 ropes. Justice had a ledger, and it was balanced. By mid-July, federal marshals arrived to restore order, but the Klan in Yazoo County had already scattered, burning their own records, hiding their symbols. The magnolia leaf became a ghost story, a whisper told to keep men awake at night. And somewhere along the Mississippi River, a lone seamstress rode under the cover of fog, a rope coiled at her feet like a sleeping snake. She didn't need to look back, because everything behind her already hung in silence. The Mississippi ran high that summer, brown, restless, and swollen with storm runoff from the north. It carried more than driftwood now. Locals along the levee began whispering about what the river had begun to return, Pieces of rope, a sash buckle, a robe half buried in silt. Every discovery seemed to arrive after heavy rain, as if the current was coughing up confessions it could no longer hold. Sound, cicadas pulsing under the thunder. Smell, wet cotton, river decay, iron. Texture, the slick pull of mud when you kneel to dig. Because though Yazoo tried to bury its story, the river refused. 2 weeks after Sheriff Granger's death, a team of federal investigators arrived from Jackson. 3 men in gray hats and pressed linen suits, carrying notebooks thick with questions. They came to impose order, but what they found was fear varnished as politeness. Every witness told the same story with small, identical errors. They used the same phrases. "No, sir, didn't see her face." Could have been anyone. Things have been strange since the flood. The agents followed the paper trail, the forged wage ledgers, the rope purchases, the destroyed Klan minutes. But none of it pointed to a suspect still living. When they asked about Clara, the record kept slipping through time. A merchant said she'd gone to Vicksburg to nurse sick children. A riverboat clerk said she'd drowned. A field hand claimed he'd seen her boarding a train wearing a widow's veil. 3 accounts, 1 certainty, no body, no crime. While the courthouse guarded its silence, the quarters remembered differently. Old Ruthie, who washed laundry for the sheriff's office, kept a careful distance until the federal men left. Then she gathered the younger women under the magnolia tree at dusk. "She made the rope speak for us," she said simply. "And we don't speak of her no more." They nodded, each recalling the night Ada was taken. The knock, the torchlight, the sheriff's horse stomping in the yard. They remembered Clara's silence after that, how she worked without complaint, eyes always somewhere else. Justice wears patience like armor. One of the girls, barely 16, asked, "Did she really do it?" "All of them." Ruthie didn't answer. She just turned her palm up to show the small scar from the night she'd helped carry a bucket of oil to the cotton gin and never told anyone. Sometimes a whole community becomes the accomplice. What would you do if silence could buy your children one more sunrise? Across Mississippi, other chapters of the Klan heard the story and began to unravel under the weight of their own terror. Meetings grew smaller. Riders hesitated before donning hoods. Men whispered that the seamstress of Yazoo was not human at all, but a specter born of vengeance. In Natchez, one man supposedly fired at a shadow that looked like a woman carrying a pail. In Greenwood, a robe was found nailed to a church door, though no one had died there. The rumor itself became its own weapon, fear multiplying faster than fire. Jackson Clarion, August 12, 1871. Terror in Yazoo. Reports of retaliatory murders by unknown parties. Citizens urged to form watch committees. No one volunteered for those committees. Back in Yazoo, Reuben Tate, the courthouse janitor who'd found the sheriff's body, kept a secret of his own. On the night after the hanging, he had swept the evidence room and found a second rope coil tucked behind a crate labeled Miscellaneous Exhibits. It wasn't the one used on Granger. It was new, untouched. Attached was a small scrap of paper written in a steady hand. For when they come again. Reuben didn't turn it in. He hid it beneath the church floorboards instead. The next Sunday, during the sermon, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time the preacher said deliverance, Reuben heard preparation. Because deliverance is never permanent in places like Yazoo. By September, the county had no sheriff, no Klan, and no appetite for either. The governor appointed a replacement from Jackson, a younger man named Aaron Holloway, who'd fought for the Union. His first act was to reopen the investigation. His second was to close it the same week. He told reporters, "No evidence remains. Let the Lord judge the rest." But privately, Holloway kept reading Clara's name in every gap of the record. He visited the levee, questioned the ferryman, and learned something odd. One flatboatman remembered a woman who'd paid with exact change, 37 cents, and insisted on rowing herself north. 37. The same number of miles between Yazoo and Vicksburg. Coincidence or message? Autumn came. The river fell quiet again, its surface glassy under gray sky. Fishermen told stories of seeing light at night drifting along the current, small flames like lanterns with no boat beneath them. One man swore he heard singing, low and rhythmic, weaving a wordless melody that matched no hymn. The story spread that Clara's spirit patrolled the Mississippi, collecting the sins it had once swallowed. For some, she was a saint. For others, a curse. But far to the north, in Vicksburg, a seamstress named Miss Cole opened a small laundry near the river docks. She charged modestly, worked alone, and never gave her first name. Customers said her hands trembled only when thunder rolled. And when the Klan tried to reform in that county, their leader was found one morning hanging from a steamboat mooring post. His robe folded, his boots lined neatly side by side. Pinned to the wood above him, a magnolia leaf, still green. By winter, newspapers moved on to other stories: railroads, elections, new laws. The nation wanted reconstruction, not reckoning. But under that silence, Clara's legend grew. Songs began appearing in black churches disguised as spirituals. She sew the robe, she break the chain, she walk the road through blood and rain. No one printed the lyrics. No one dared. Yet the melody traveled faster than any headline. A secret testimony passed hand to hand. Some called it the seamstress hymn, others Ida's song. And so, long after her boat vanished upriver, Clara became both story and strategy, a whisper of what happens when justice refuses to die quietly. At year's end, Reuben returned to the magnolia tree, dug up the rope he'd hidden months before, and stared at it until dawn. He knew what it meant. He also knew the federal men would never understand, because vengeance was only the opening stitch. The pattern was still unfolding. The new year of 1872 began under a frost that turned Yazoo's mud roads into mirrors. The magnolia tree stood bare, its roots gripping the frozen earth like knuckles. Most of the town wanted to forget what had happened, but the land itself wouldn't let them. Every thaw brought small reminders, fibers snagged on fence posts, ashes buried shallow, the smell of smoke when there was no fire. Even when the breeze came soft from the river, it carried an undertone of rope and iron, because some stories refused to stay buried. It started in the fields. A melody hummed during the picking lines, slow, deliberate, half lullaby, half warning. No one claimed to write it, yet everyone knew the tune. It traveled faster than talk, carried by those who understood the danger of speaking truth in daylight. The children sang it while shelling peas, the elders while sharpening tools. The words changed with each verse, but the refrain stayed the same. She sewed the robe, she broke the chain, justice came walking in the rain. Federal officers called it an incitement. Preachers called it a lament. But the people who sang it called it what it was, a promise. Sheriff Holloway couldn't ignore the hymn's spread. Each report he filed mentioned new unrest. He wanted peace, not ghosts. Yet every clue pointed him back to the same invisible hand. One morning, a package arrived at his office with no sender. Inside lay a spool of thread, coiled perfectly, and a note written in the same tidy cursive that once marked Yazoo's ledgers. "You can't mend what you won't admit is torn." He locked it away and told no one. At night, he dreamed of a woman standing in floodwater up to her knees, holding a lantern shaped like a magnolia blossom. She didn't speak. She only waited, as though time itself answered to her patience. A seamstress named Sarah Cole had built a quiet life near the docks. Her shop smelled of starch and camphor, her hands always busy. Customers admired her neatness, how every hem fell straight, how each buttonhole matched perfectly. One afternoon, a soldier on leave brought in a torn jacket. "You've got the touch of a surgeon," he said with a grin. "You sew like someone who's seen wounds." Sarah smiled faintly. "I've seen repairs," she replied. Behind her, a single magnolia leaf hung above the mirror, pressed between glass. That spring, 2 known Klansmen were found drowned downstream, their horses still tethered on shore. Locals blamed the current. Sarah Cole closed her shop for a week. When she reopened, she had a new scar across her wrist and a different hymn on her lips. In Yazoo, those who'd once laughed at superstition began locking their doors before dusk. The newspaper stopped printing obituaries altogether, saying only "departed." At the colored church by the Mill Road, the hymn changed again. "Don't sew the robe, don't wear the name. The river keeps what men inflame." When asked about its meaning, Pastor Green smiled wearily. "Every river baptizes what the law refuses to cleanse," he said. And though he never spoke Clara's name, he kept a pressed leaf in his Bible. By midsummer, a new group of men tried to resurrect the Klan under another banner. They met secretly in the old Cotton Gin ruins, the same place 2 men had burned months before. They swore oaths in whispers, promising revenge for their fallen brothers. The first meeting ended early when someone found a white robe already hanging above the doorway, still wet from rain, the hem sewn with crimson thread. The men dispersed into the night, but none returned for the next meeting. A storm moved through 2 days later. The following morning, the gin was gone, struck by lightning. The smell of ozone mixed with charred wood drifted for miles. Sheriff Holloway rode out to inspect the ruins. Buried under ash, he found a melted needle fused to the ground. Not lightning, design. There were always witnesses, always those too young to understand and too wise to forget. A 10-year-old boy named Jacob claimed he saw a woman walking near the levee the night before the fire. She carried a pail and hummed the seamstress hymn. His mother hushed him. "Don't speak her name, not even in dreams." But Jacob drew what he'd seen, a figure standing in water, robes floating around her like lily petals. Years later, that drawing would appear in a Chicago pamphlet titled "The Seamstress of Yazoo," true account of a Southern haunting. Haunting or history depends on who's telling it. In the state archives, a letter still exists, dated September 3, 1872. To the Office of Reconstruction Oversight, "The killings in Yazoo have ceased, but the silence is unnatural. The colored folk speak of a hymn that stops men from riding. No arrests have been made. Perhaps justice has been achieved by other means." Signed, A. Holloway, Sheriff, the next day. Holloway resigned without explanation and left Mississippi altogether. That winter, seamstresses across the South began using a peculiar stitch, 2 small loops and a pull through the middle, known locally as the Yazoo tie. It held stronger than a knot, broke cleaner under pressure, and became a secret symbol among freed women. Some said it came from a woman who had sewn judgment into her seams. In churchyards and workrooms, Magnolia blossoms were left at night on doorsteps, each with a strand of red thread. No threats, just remembrance. Justice had become its own quiet language. By the time snow touched the Mississippi Delta again, the hymn had spread to Louisiana, Alabama, even parts of Georgia. People said when it was sung under a waxing moon, it carried an echo that wasn't quite human, a harmony faint and fierce, like a needle pulling through cloth. And somewhere upriver, in a cabin that smelled of starch and smoke, a woman set down her sewing and closed her ledger for good. But the story she stitched into the land would never come undone. The needle keeps moving. The year turned again. 1873, Reconstruction faltered under new laws, new violence, and new lies. But in Yazoo County, there were no more night rides. The silence that replaced them was not peace. It was memory, sitting in the corners of every room like smoke that refused to leave. And then, out of nowhere, came a man determined to exhume the story. His name was Samuel Dorsey, an investigator for the Freedmen's Bureau and a former Union scout who still carried a bullet lodged near his spine. He had read the reports: 12 dead Klansmen, 1 vanished sheriff, and a seamstress no one would name. When he arrived in Yazoo that spring, he brought with him a map already marked with red pins stretching along the river from Natchez to Vicksburg. Each pin corresponded to a rumor. Each rumor had a pattern. Sound: hooves crunching dry shell road. Smell: tobacco, ink, and river silt. Texture: brittle paper that tore if you looked too hard. Because the closer Dorsey looked, the more the story stitched itself into everything. He began in the courthouse, where Sheriff Holloway's old desk sat untouched. Beneath the drawer lining, Dorsey found something small, a strip of muslin embroidered with 6 perfect stitches in crimson thread. Next to it lay a half-finished note. The last one fell near Vicksburg. The rest will come to understand. The handwriting was feminine, deliberate. Not Holloway's, not Granger's. Dorsey folded the cloth into his ledger and headed toward the river towns where similar killings had been whispered. At each stop, he found traces: a magnolia leaf pinned to a fence post, a spool of thread on a preacher's step, initials carved into trees that didn't belong to lovers. People told him not to ask questions. They said the same up in Vicksburg, one ferryman muttered, and then the river took another man wearing white. At the edge of Vicksburg's dock quarter, Dorsey found her, an older black woman named Hattie Cole, who ran a laundry behind a saloon. She walked with a limp, wore gloves even in heat, and hummed when she worked. The melody was the seamstress hymn. He asked how she learned it. Hattie didn't stop scrubbing. "Same way you learn the Lord's Prayer," she said, from somebody who needed to be believed. When Dorsey mentioned the name Clara, her hands froze in the water. "Don't use that name here," she whispered. She earned her rest. Rest where? Hattie looked toward the river. Everywhere she was needed. That night, Dorsey stood by the water's edge, listening to barges creak. The moon turned the surface silver, hiding what the current carried below. He couldn't tell if he wanted truth or confirmation of myth. In Reconstruction Mississippi, sometimes those were the same thing. Dorsey's own notes grew strange, each page filled with observations that read like confessions. May 8th, 1873. I follow a trail stitched rather than walked. May 10th. Every rope has a signature. Hers is symmetry. He compared handwriting samples from store ledgers, church registries, and army contracts. The same hand appeared again and again, a curling G, a bent R, a deliberate cross on every T. The same pattern Clara Whitfield had once used when she signed receipts for laundry in Yazoo. The more he found, the less sense it made. Some signatures were dated after her supposed disappearance. Others came from counties hundreds of miles apart, all on the same week. Either there were many seamstresses, or one who could move like rumor itself. On June 15th, Dorsey met with Reverend Green, now a graying man with tired eyes. They sat in the empty church where the hymn had first been sung. The Reverend opened his Bible and pulled out a pressed magnolia leaf. It was still green at the veins. "She taught me this," he said. "Justice is like thread. You can't see the pattern till it's done." "Did you ever meet her?" "I preached over her once," Green said. "Or maybe I preached over what she left behind." Which was courage. He closed the Bible and looked at Dorsey. "Tell me, sir, what are you looking for? Justice or closure?" Dorsey didn't answer, because deep down, he didn't know. That same night, the old courthouse bell rang twice. Sharp, distant, impossible. The new sheriff checked the tower and found a single coil of rope hanging from the beam, tied with the Yazoo stitch. No one had touched that rope since Granger's death 2 years prior. Pinned to the beam was another note. "The river forgets nothing." Within a week, half the county had left flowers beneath the magnolia tree, some for forgiveness, others for fear. Dorsey joined them at dusk, hat in hand, notebook closed. He felt absurdly that he was being watched. He turned. Nothing, just the slow ripple of leaves. Merchants raised prices, preachers gave quieter sermons, and local men avoided gathering in groups after sundown. The Klan names faded from conversation. Freedmen began buying land, their deeds signed with shaky hands but firm resolve. Even silence can become a weapon when wielded together. Dorsey documented it all, progress born from terror, and wondered if one woman's vengeance had done more to change Yazoo than any act of Congress. "What would you do," he wrote in his journal, "if the only justice left was the one you had to sew by hand?" By August, Dorsey's map was full. Each red pin marked another place where the hymn had been heard, another man who vanished, another rope found. When he laid it flat, the pins formed the shape of a river, twisting, dividing, rejoining. It was as though Clara's path had become the Mississippi itself, endless, shifting, unstoppable. He wrote one final report to Washington, sealed it, and never mailed it. "Justice here is handmade. Let it be." The map disappeared into bureau archives a year later, its pins rusting quietly under dust. But on rainy nights, workers claimed to hear a faint humming from the shelves, a woman's voice, steady and calm, counting the rhythm of a needle. And outside, the magnolia tree bloomed again, white petals glowing against the dark like lanterns for souls who'd finally found their way home. The river forgets nothing. The Bureau closed its Yazoo office in 1874, declaring the region stable. But stability, as anyone who'd lived there knew, was only the quiet before the next breaking. When the federal men left, they took their papers, but they did not take the stories. Those stayed, hidden in songs, stitched into seams, whispered during baptisms when water masked the sound of truth. And beneath the floorboards of the old courthouse, something else waited. Sound, dripping rain on tin roofs. Smell, dust, old paper, magnolia sap. Texture, threadbare wood worn smooth by years of sweeping, because the dead leaf marks you can still trip over. In the spring of 1875, the courthouse janitor, Reuben Tate, the same man who'd once found the sheriff hanging, was ordered to prepare the building for renovation. The county wanted to forget, to replace the echo of rope with the shuffle of new business. When Reuben pried up the warped planks beneath the bell tower, his crowbar struck metal. Beneath the boards lay a small tin box, sealed tight with melted wax. He took it home, hid it under his bed, and waited 3 nights before opening it. Inside were scraps, faded muslin, a spool of red thread, and a folded paper note written in that same elegant, steady hand. When the time comes again, remember the measure. 2 lengths for the sin, 1 for the sorrow. Reuben read it aloud once, then never again. He wrapped the box in cloth and buried it beneath the magnolia tree. When asked years later why he hadn't shown anyone, he said, "Because the river don't need reminding." By then, time had already turned the story into legend. Parents warned their children not to mock the seamstress hymn, not to sing it near water. They said if you did, you might see her reflection instead of your own. But among the freed families, the hymn became a lullaby of endurance. Mothers sang it while rocking their babies. Stitch the name, close the seam, justice walks where none can dream. A century later, field recordings of those same verses would appear in the Library of Congress under anonymous Delta Spiritual. The notes identify its origin simply as Yazoo County, date uncertain. History always the slowest witness. Reconstruction faltered, and with it, the brief promise of equality. By 1876, white militias had begun to reform under new names. The Redeemers, the Patriots, the Night Committees. The hoods came back, paler than ever. But their first ride ended before it began. At a crossroads north of Yazoo, 6 riders were found the next morning. Horses gone, torches still burning in the dirt. Each man was alive, but every robe had been stolen. Nailed to a nearby fence post hung a single stitched message: "I am not gone." The sheriff filed no report. No one sang that week. In August of the same year, a postmaster in Vicksburg found a bundle of undelivered mail in the false bottom of an old sorting table. Among them was a letter addressed to Mr. S. Dorsey, Bureau of Freedmen, Washington City. It read, "Sir, if you still seek the seamstress, you will not find her in the flesh. The hands change, but the work remains. A woman cannot kill a hatred so large, but she can teach others how to measure it. If ever they rise again, follow the stitches." No signature, only a pressed magnolia leaf, still faintly fragrant after years. Dorsey had died 3 months earlier. By the early 1880s, sewing circles led by freed women had spread through Mississippi and Louisiana. They called themselves guilds, claiming to teach trade skills to newly freed girls, but their patterns carried messages. In one preserved sampler dated 1882, tiny embroidered letters form a repeating line: 2 lengths for the sin, 1 for the sorrow. Historians would later mistake it for a quilting code. They missed what it really was, a blueprint for vengeance disguised as domestic work. The same year, a former Confederate officer disappeared near Natchez. His body was never found, but his horse came home with a piece of muslin tied to the saddle ring. Red thread, magnolia scent. In Yazoo, life went on. Children played under the magnolia tree, unaware they were treading on buried secrets. Farmers rebuilt the gin. The courthouse hosted weddings instead of trials, and everyone pretended the hymn was just a song. But some nights, when storms rolled across the delta and thunder shook the glass, the elders would close their shutters and murmur, "She's walking again." What would you do if the justice you prayed for once came back, still sewing, still watching, never aging? A century later, folklorists visiting Yazoo would capture that same hum on wax cylinders. One recording, labeled simply Yazoo Delta 1905, carries faint singing beneath the static. Female voices, weaving words older than the war. Magnolia blooming, blood undone, thread of mercy, thread of none. When played backward, the melody forms a rhythm that matches a weaver's shuttle. Pull, loop, tighten. No one could explain how those women knew a verse never written down. Time can erase names, but it cannot unteach a song. That winter, a heavy flood carved a new channel through the delta. It washed away half of old Yazoo, including the courthouse foundation. When the water receded, workers found a tin box caught between the roots of the magnolia tree. Inside, thread, still red, still unbroken. 2 lengths for the sin, 1 for the sorrow. And nearby, pressed into the mud, a single footprint too small to belong to any man. The work remains. By the dawn of the 20th century, Yazoo County looked like progress had finally won. The courthouse rebuilt in bright white brick, the rail line expanded, the cotton bales shipped north again. But the ground beneath it all, still the same soil that had drunk too much truth, remembered. Every spring, magnolia blossoms bloomed earlier around the old courthouse hill. The elders said the roots grew fat on stories the living refused to tell. The children didn't believe them, not yet, but they would. Because history has a habit of humming. In 1923, a young black historian named Eleanor Finch arrived in Yazoo on a fellowship to document folk songs of the Reconstruction era. She carried a wax cylinder recorder, a camera, and a belief that even the darkest stories could be saved from extinction. She started at the church by the Mill Road, where she heard the seamstress hymn for the first time. Sung by 3 women in their 60s, the tune felt older than the building itself. Eleanor transcribed the lyrics carefully. Measure twice, cut once more, freedom threads through every door. When she asked where the song came from, one woman answered without hesitation, from the one who taught justice to sow. The others nodded, solemn. Sound, the faint static hiss of wax recording. Smell, camphor, starch, and kerosene lamps. Texture, linen hymn books, calloused fingers tracing verses. Eleanor didn't yet know that she had stumbled into something Yazoo had protected for half a century. The women she interviewed were descendants of those who had known Clara. The laundresses, the cooks, the field hands who had watched history tilt on its axis. When Eleanor mentioned the word revenge, one woman, Aunt Ruthie's granddaughter, straightened sharply. No, child, it wasn't revenge. It was remembering what the law forgot. In the courthouse basement, Eleanor unearthed a box of moldy papers marked Miscellaneous Evidence, 1871. Among receipts and rusted nails lay a folded scrap of muslin stitched with the letters CW and a date, July 2nd. She recognized the thread pattern from the stories she'd heard. The same looping Yazoo stitch. Beneath it, faint handwriting. My sister is free. The archivist on duty, a tired man who'd seen too much, told her to burn it. You won't like what people say if they think you digging up old sins, he warned. She didn't burn it. She photographed it instead. That photo, mislabeled Unknown Textile Sample Mississippi C. 1870s, would later appear in a Smithsonian exhibit under the title Voices of Resistance. Eleanor's recordings drew attention from universities in the North, but in Yazoo, not everyone was pleased. A new sheriff, descendant of the Granger line, paid her a visit one afternoon, hat in hand, voice polite and cold. Best not stir ghosts, he told her. They don't like being measured. That night, someone broke into her boarding house room. Her notes were scattered, her wax cylinders cracked, but one survived, the one labeled Yazoo Delta Number 7. On it, faint singing, followed by another sound, 3 deliberate knocks, like someone tapping on wood beside the microphone. She'd been alone when she recorded it. The next morning, Eleanor walked to the old Magnolia Hill. The air was thick with humidity and something sweeter, heavier, like memory in bloom. Beneath the tree's shadow, she found a small wooden spool half buried in the soil. Red thread, still coiled tight. When she touched it, a single magnolia petal fell, though it wasn't the season for shedding. She took the spool with her, wrapped in linen, and left Yazoo 2 days later. Her field report would note simply, "Local oral tradition identifies a freedwoman seamstress as the origin of the hymn. Her acts are recounted not as violence, but as divine correction." Legend persists that her tools reappear when needed. 50 years after Clara vanished into the river, her story had grown into something larger than a name. People no longer debated what she had done. They debated what she meant. Was she justice or vengeance? A savior or a sinner? A woman or a myth built by those who survived her? And for every argument, the hymn answered softly in the background, reminding them, "The river keeps what men forget." What would you do, hearing that song, knowing it began with a woman who'd been told all her life to be silent? Would you call it haunting or homecoming? Eleanor Finch returned to Chicago and presented her findings. Scholars dismissed her Yazoo files as exaggerated folklore. Only one recording, the 7th cylinder, went missing from her collection before it could be archived. A janitor later claimed he found the cylinder box sitting open one morning, a faint magnolia scent in the air. When played decades later by an archivist at the University of Illinois, the cylinder revealed not just singing, but a woman's whisper at the end, barely audible under static. "Measure twice, the rest you'll learn." The archivist assumed it was Eleanor herself, but the voice was older, deeper, and had an accent no one could place. Through the 20th century, the seamstress hymn resurfaced during moments of unrest. Union strikes in the 30s, civil rights marches in the 60s. Always hummed, never credited, always anonymous. Every time justice stumbled, someone began to sew again. In 1964, when civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi, mourners at a church vigil sang an old song from Yazoo. No one taught it to them. They said it just came back. History was still measuring. The needle moves again. At dawn, the Yazoo River looked harmless. Mist curling over the water like silk ribbon, slow and deliberate. But locals still said it moved with memory. Beneath the calm, the current whispered names. Some swore that if you stood on the bank long enough, you could hear the sound of a woman sewing underwater. Sound, soft lapping against wood. Smell, river mud and magnolia. Texture, damp rope, rough and waiting. Justice takes its time. In the spring of 1978, nearly a century after Clara's vengeance, a new bridge project uncovered human remains along the Yazoo Bend, bones tangled in what appeared to be rope and cloth. The construction halted immediately. County authorities assumed it was a Civil War grave, but when the cloth fragments were examined, they found something strange. The fabric wasn't cotton. It was muslin, threaded with red-dyed linen, each strand still bright. Pinned to the cloth was a rusted sewing needle, and on the shank, barely visible, the initials CW scratched by hand. The county sheriff sealed the report. The workers who found it told reporters they'd unearthed an old burial, then stopped speaking of it altogether. But the rumor spread faster than the water could rise again. The next Sunday, the church bell in Yazoo struck 12 times without being rung. The ropes hung still, untouched. Old women whispered that it was the count of the ones who died by Clara's hand. By the following week, a magnolia sprout had appeared at the dig site. No one planted it. No one dared cut it down. The lead foreman resigned and left the state. He'd found his work boots tied together by red thread outside his door. The project never resumed. Records from the bridge construction were later archived in Jackson, but in 1983 the Yazoo courthouse flooded during a storm. The entire basement, where those remains had been cataloged, was submerged. By the time the water receded, the files were gone. One archivist claimed she'd seen them floating like white lilies, the ink washing away before her eyes. Another swore that when the lights flickered, she heard humming through the intercom. A woman's voice, old and steady, keeping time with the rain. Her supervisor wrote it off as stress, but that archivist quit the next morning, leaving behind only a note. She's still measuring. Decades passed. The story faded into rural superstition. Then, in the early 2000s, a genealogist researching Reconstruction records noticed a pattern in public archives. A string of anonymous donations made to historical societies across Mississippi, each for exactly $37. No name, no address. Only a magnolia stamped on the envelope. That same year, a small museum in Jackson received an unmarked package containing a spool of red thread and a page torn from a century-old sewing manual. On it, a handwritten line. For every hatred born, there must be a seam that closes it. The handwriting matched Eleanor Finch's notes from 1923, but Eleanor had died in 1961. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Travis Moore visited Yazoo to record local oral histories. Among the interviews was one with an elderly woman named Miss Aurelia James, who claimed to be the granddaughter of a freedwoman seamstress. Halfway through the interview, the power cut out. On playback, her voice distorted, but not from static. A second voice echoed faintly behind hers, almost reciting her words in unison. When the lights returned, Miss Aurelia looked toward the window and said, "She don't like being filmed." Travis laughed nervously. "Who?" Aurelia smiled. "The one who keeps the measure." When he packed his equipment later, he found a single magnolia petal pressed inside his notebook. He hadn't seen her move from her chair. If justice returned wearing the face of the wronged, would you welcome her or hide the mirrors? Would you call her murderer or savior, ghost or guardian? Or would you, like those who watched from porches a century before, pretend you didn't hear the singing in the distance and tell yourself it was just the wind? Every society decides what it's willing to call justice. Clara Whitmore only reminded the world that silence is never neutral. Historians now agree Clara's story sits somewhere between legend and record. No official document names her as the killer. No grave bears her name. Yet the details persist across time. The red thread, the magnolia, the sewing needle that turns up where injustice once lived. And sometimes, late at night, a church in Yazoo still receives a folded scrap of muslin through its mail slot. Always the same size, always hand-stitched with those same words. 2 lengths for the sin, 1 for the sorrow. The caretaker burns them quietly before Sunday service, though he never tells anyone why. They say when the Yazoo River runs high and the wind carries the smell of magnolia, you can see a figure on the far bank, barefoot, skirt hem dark with water, sewing needle glinting in her hand. Each stitch a name, each name a reckoning. The black woman who hunted the Ku Klux Klan still walks the river's edge. Justice takes its time. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.